Now, international affairs editor Douglas Herbert is joining me on set. Doug, let's talk a bit more about these sanctions, right? Because today's events are obviously
not all frozen assets.
The news is moving on a pace, but we've got 2 days of sanctions from the US and the EU. Were these coordinated? Was it just chance they happened together? How do you see this dual punch?
No, it's the former. It was coordinated, not because I say it was coordinated, but because Ursula von der Leyen was given a heads up by the U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, basically saying this was coming. And this is why you have this collective sigh of relief in Europe, because, the summit, right, the context is everything here. Instead of having a U.S. where Donald Trump seems to be, swinging in the Putin camp and pulling back from Ukraine, at least you have a configuration, an alignment of sorts, where you have for the first time since Trump returned to the White House last January, you have the U.S. for the first time slapping sanctions on Russia's real energy sector, its two biggest oil companies. Rosneft and Lukoil, when you talk about oil in Russia, those are the two biggest games in town. Now, what's interesting is that it's not the first time that the U.S. administration has sanctioned Russian energy companies, oil companies. There were two that were sanctioned under the Biden administration, big ones. One was under Gazprom. It's Gazprom Neft, the oil company wing of Gazprom. You also had something called Surgutneftgaz, which was an oil gas company as well. But those were 3 and 4. They were not. Biden basically stood back from targeting the biggest ones, perhaps because he was fearful of the impact it might have on oil prices at a time where, as you remember, inflation was, a really big deal, still is in the U.S. and the world economy, but was a really big deal, didn't want to exacerbate things and drive prices higher. So he sort of held off on this move today. Two biggest companies. The question is, what do they do and will they work, right? It's one thing because, look, sanctions and sanctions. The EU sanctions are important, right? They're going after the liquefied natural gas, which is literally gas in liquid form. And so those are significant. EU's also adding a number of ships. I think it's 117 of these so-called shadow fleet vessels, ships, to their list of sanctioned Russian illegal vessels trying to ship and circumvent the oil price cap around the world. So I think it's almost about 560 ships altogether right now, Russian shadow ships on the EU list. That's not to be sneezed at. Those are important. The reason I say the U.S. sanctions at the end of the day are the things that matter and are going to work is because if the U.S. goes after financial institutions, i.e. banks, that are enabling Russia to do the transactions which allow Russia to sell its oil to countries like China, like India, like Turkey, that could have a giant impact. And at the end of the day, a lot of these banks, a lot of these companies, oil refiners in these countries, they need to go through the U.S. financial system. The dollar still dominates, whether people like it or not. That might change in the near future. Who knows? But for now, dollar's still the name of the game by and large. Banks need access to the U.S. dollar. They need access to the U.S. banking and financial system. Anything that threatens to cut them off or punish them for doing business with Russia, that's going to hurt a lot. That's why I say the U.S. sanctions could have a little bit of an impact. But at the end of the day, and I said this earlier, Putin is determined to wage his war on his terms and address the so-called root causes till the bitter end. I don't think this is going to in any way change Putin's behavior. Could it hit the Russian economy? Absolutely.
Well, look, we're already potentially seeing one of those impacts from an exclusive report that Reuters News has just published, citing trade sources that Chinese state oil majors have already suspended purchases of seaborne
That's big news.
Russian oil
Seaborne
after
Russian
sanctions.
That's big news, and we're also hearing that some Indian companies might be inclined to pull back. Remember, India has been a big purchaser of Russian oil as well. Under certain contracts, it has to sort of keep buying that Russian oil for maybe 2-3 more years. But anything that gives it a potential off-ramp, an exit ramp, and sanctions, right? Penalties under U.S. sanctions could be a good opt-out. Hey, we can't buy your oil anymore, Vladimir Putin. Look what's going to happen to us. That could give it the legal opt-out it needs to pull out. So that China story, that's significant, as is what's happening with some Indian companies if they end up also getting sort of a stage fright and pulling out from buying Russian oil.
And look, Doug, you've been coming onto this set again and again, analysing for us all the impact of all the various sanctions there have been after the last few years.
Yeah.
Same question. Does Vladimir Putin care?
Yeah, well, no, and I just said, right, I explicitly said, Vladimir Putin has made it very clear in both his words, but more importantly in his behavior, that he has scoffed at sanctions. He sees sanctions as a weak, very blunt instrument used by the West. The West goes on. In his mind, the West drones on and on about sanctions. It sounds good. They talk the talk about sanctions. At the end of the day, it's not hurting them. If you go, for a lot of Russians, they go to stores, they go to buy things. Surprisingly, if you have money in Russia, you could still get just about anything. Very little's changed. Even some of the former Western shops that had to shut down or pulled out and were handed over to Russian licensed stores, they've kept essentially the same operating methods. They've often kept the same equipment, and a lot of the products look exactly the same. The labels sometimes are exactly the same. So for many ordinary Russians, they don't notice that much of a difference. Except, sure, there's not McDonald's, but there's something very close to it. But yeah, I would say in terms of oil industry, watch that space away from the consumer goods. It's giant. Rosneft, Lukoil, I will just note to you and leave it at that. They are half of Russia's crude oil exports. And taxes from the energy industry in Russia are about a quarter, 25% of Russia's total budget. That gives you a sort of sense of why it's significant when sanctions go after the biggest energy players in the market.
As a layman observer looking at this, because we know that Trump flip-flops so frequently, are the sanctions that he just imposed something that he'll be able to flop out of again?
Yeah, well, sure, he could, absolutely. And the flip-flop is exactly what sort of worries investors, worries the markets, keep the oil price volatile, up and down, boomeranging here and there. We do not know what the staying power, the stamina of Trump in imposing these sanctions will be. Europe is obviously, and we heard a little bit of this from Armin, Europe's obviously hoping, praying that Trump is on side right now, that he will remain on side, that he is they're all really reading from the same play script. But yeah, it's true. And the uncertainty is exactly what Vladimir Putin is banking on, because there's a feeling here in Europe, and not just in Europe, that Donald Trump is never more than one phone call away from another flip-flop, swinging to the other camp. Today it happens to be more pro-Ukraine, seen as more pro-Ukraine, more exasperated at Putin, more in a punitive stance and posture towards Vladimir Putin. He could change on a dime. That could flip tomorrow. I could be back here on the set tomorrow saying to you, yep, he's telling Zelensky to give up that territory again, and those sanctions on Russia, they're off again.
Yeah, spare a thought for those Ukrainian diplomats. It must be absolutely exhausting.